Welcome to People Pulse, the podcast where we explore the dynamic intersection of HR, culture, and innovation. I'm Nena Dimovska, your host, and today we'll dive deep into the world of corporate culture with none other than Charlie Sull. Charlie is a globally established expert in corporate culture and co-founder of CultureX. His work, including the Measuring Culture series in MIT Sloan Management Review, reaches millions and helps redefine how companies measure and enhance their culture. In today's episode, we'll uncover insights on people and culture intelligence, build positive workplace cultures, use technology for culture measurement, address toxic behavior, and much more. Okay, so let's dive in. So, Charlie,
Okay.
you've described workplace culture as a company's operating system, and you've emphasized that improving it requires will and knowledge, especially buying from top management and effectively listening to employees. And you've also pointed out that most companies don't really listen well. So what we'd like to hear is how can managers use the right tools or approaches to truly listen and in doing so turn culture into a measurable, actionable asset that really drives business outcomes.
Yeah, definitely. That's my whole spiel. You summarized it perfectly. Yeah, I mean, where to start? I mean, so yeah, how we think of culture is as an operating system. So a lot of times in companies, especially in HR departments, culture is thought of as purely an employee experience phenomenon. So culture becomes things like, ping pong tables and gift cards to Dunkin' Donuts and all these things. And culture is thought of as purely in terms of employee satisfaction. But really, if you're thinking about culture in that way, you're missing a large part of why it's important and especially why it creates financial value. So, a different way to think about culture is as this invisible operating system that's governing literally thousands of important algorithms within a company. So, anything from you're in a meeting, with your boss, you've just happened on a sensitive issue that could derail the whole project, but it's a little bit sensitive. So do you raise your hand or do you not raise your hand? That's an algorithm, a cultural algorithm around psychological
Yeah.
safety. Or another algorithm is you're a local manager in I don't know, Sweden, and you've just discovered that there's this changing market condition in Sweden. Well, do you proactively respond to that changing market condition and make changes with autonomy, or do you report back to headquarters and wait for weeks and weeks until headquarters makes the decision and then tells you what to do? That's a cultural algorithm around agility and ownership. So those are just two examples. And culture is governing thousands and thousands of algorithms like these, important decisions like these that do affect the employee experience. So they affect things like respect, inclusion, collaboration has some impact on the employee experience. So culture is actually, we found, the number one most powerful driver of the employee experience. So we did a study of more than 1 million Glassdoor reviews using a sophisticated what we call drivers analysis called the SHAT methodology. It was cited for a Nobel Prize. And what we found is if you look at what drives the overall Glassdoor rating for more than 1 million employees, the number one driver by far is culture, accounting for about 40% of the overall variance in Glassdoor ratings. So that's more than 3 times as powerful as compensation. So that's a little tangent. Culture is also the most powerful driver of the employee experience. But it's not just the employee experience. There's also things like agility, innovation, ownership, execution, cross-unit collaboration, processes, all these things that don't necessarily impact the employee experience too much. But nevertheless, these are all being governed by culture. So that's why culture is so important. And then, yeah, my whole spiel is in order to improve culture, you only need two things. You need will and you need knowledge. And by will, I mean you need top team prioritization. You need buy-in, preferably from the CEO, him or herself, and as many of the top team as you can get. And the reason that level of buy-in is so crucial is because improving culture involves pulling on a lot of different levers. So anything from, performance management to work design to who the distributed leaders are to all these different levers. really only the top team is going to be able to make the decisions that have a big impact. And of course, middle managers and frontline employees have a role to play. But really, one thing we're very clear about is that culture cannot be changed from the bottom. It cannot be changed from the middle. To really change a culture, you need top team buy-in. So that's why one of the two things you need to improve a culture is top team buy-in.
Great.
And the second thing is knowledge. So one of the big barriers to improving culture, especially up until recently, is, what is culture? It's
Exactly.
so abstract. It can mean a million different things. Everyone has an armchair opinion about what the culture is. Very little of it is actually grounded in
Yeah.
evidence. So to improve the culture, you need an evidence-based, kind of scientific, data-driven understanding of what the culture actually is, how it varies across the company, what's driving important outcomes, how the culture is changing over time, how you benchmark versus peers externally. You need really strong, data-driven, credible, evidence-based answers to all these questions if you're going to make progress on the culture. And then you also need to know, okay, so say I've looked across all these dimensions, I've done all this analysis, and I see that psychological safety is the key issue that I have to focus on in order to improve the culture. And I know exactly where in the company psychological safety is breaking down. So that's all great. You have a lot of the insight you need to improve the culture. But then the final step is you need to actually know how to improve psychological safety. So you can get answers to all of these questions, both what is the culture and what are the highest impact ways to improve the culture, by listening to employees. You just need an effective listening strategy. But the wrinkle is most companies, I would say, 95% plus of companies are not listening to employees effectively today. And if they are listening to employees at all, I mean, there are a lot of companies that just don't have any kind of survey or any kind of listening strategy whatsoever. So that's one thing. But most companies do have a listening strategy, but by and large, for the lion's share of them, it depends on this very old-timey 1 to 5 point scale survey. So on a scale 1 to 5, do I agree with this? Do I agree with that? Do I agree with that? And on for dozens of questions. I mean, the McKinsey OHI has, I think, 150 questions. It's
Yeah.
crazy. And this survey has a lot of limitations. I mean, this survey design was designed in 1932. It's pretty old. When Herbert Hoover was president, that's when this survey was designed. And one of the limitations is when faced with all these repetitive questions, employees just completely zone out and they answer almost every question with almost the same answer. So they just go through the survey and pretty much just in a straight line answer all the different questions with almost the same answer. So it results in very repetitive, low quality data. And when you're trying to capture something as complex and sophisticated and nuanced and rich and multidimensional as culture, you need a smart
Yeah.
tool. And if you're relying on this kind of repetitive, low quality data where the employees arguably aren't even paying attention, you're never going to be able to learn very much about culture and all of its complexity. Maybe you'll identify a couple of the most obvious things about the culture. If you're lucky, you'll get kind of the rough outline. But in order to really understand culture, you need a more sophisticated tool. You need to be able to understand this with human language, because human language is very smart. Human language can capture a lot of complexity, a lot of nuance, many dimensions. So that's basically why we advocate for this new kind of cultural measurement that only came out a few years ago, and we think is going to really revolutionize cultural management and improve a lot of cultures, which is all based around natural language analysis, which AI, for the first time, really allows you to actually do very well. So when you have this sophisticated natural language analysis, now you're not using this, 1932, 100-year-old survey, all these repetitive questions. Now you're using a survey instrument can understand, okay, in this case, the employee's talking about friendly employees, and in this case, the employee's talking about psychological safety, and in this case, the employee's talking about flexible operating processes. The AI can understand hundreds of these dimensions with high levels of accuracy and reliability and give you back a really accurate, high definition portrait of what your culture actually is, and also by mining employee context and feedback, find highly actionable ways to improve the culture. So basically, what this AI revolution and cultural management is doing is giving you the second piece of the puzzle. It's giving you knowledge. Now, for the first time, or well, I mean, it was possible before, but now it's a lot easier to do this. You can get really good answers to the two questions: what is our culture, and what are the highest impact ways to improve our culture? But of course, that's only half of the battle. The other half of the battle is getting top
Mm.
team prioritization. And if you don't have top team prioritization, you can have the best insights in the world, and the culture is still not gonna improve much.
Thank you. You've offered like wealth of advice, actionable advice here. I have a few follow-up questions for you. First off, one thing that I believe that every leader can bring back with them is the impact of why you should start investing in improving the culture in the first place. The research that you briefly mentioned, I think it's very interesting just to emphasize. You said that culture is the first and largest influencer of employee satisfaction or employee experience, right? That's what your research found?
That's what
Wow,
we
I mean,
found, yeah.
that's such a game changer because it just pivots the hierarchy of needs as it was used to known. You know, like back in the days, managers and leaders thought that if the comp and ben are okay, then, 80% Pareto of the job in employee experience was done. But what you're saying is that now there's a lot of research out there that shows that it's just not enough and that we have to make this strategic decision and invest into improving and understanding our culture, right? So like there's no longer room for excuses like what's culture? Is it worth investing here? Should it be a priority? So that's no longer the case. And I think that's something I would say of refreshing perspective that should be taken into consideration.
Yeah, that's definitely what we're trying to advocate for. But to be honest, it's a small movement. There aren't too many people like my co-founder and I. I mean, there are a
Hmm.
few. There are people advocating for this message. Culture
Hmm.
matters with, and there's a lot of research to back it up. I think that, only a couple of years ago, yeah, when you think about the employee experience, it's basically a compensation
Mm.
story. And the reason for that is because compensation is so
Mm.
tangible. It's so easy to measure. It's so easy
Yeah.
to change that lever. So that's because it's such an easy measure, it's such an easy lever to pull. That would be the main lever that most
Yeah.
companies would use to adjust the employee experience. And then of course there's things like, like Google does, all these sushi chefs and ping pong tables and all that stuff. I mean, maybe that matters a little bit, but we are in the early days now, and I hope it just takes off.
Mm.
I mean, I'm pushing as hard as I can for it. We'll see if it actually works. But what we want to happen is for leadership to actually take culture
Mm.
seriously. And partially, part of what needs to happen in order for that to happen is culture has to be demystified from this, very
Exactly.
abstract phenomenon that can mean a million of different things to a million of different people, and there's not too much evidence behind any of
Exactly.
it, into something quantifiable and that can be measured and understood with something of a scientific
Exactly.
approach. And then if you can do that, then you can just talk about culture the same way as you can talk about any other asset in a
Mm.
company. And when you think about culture that way, well, culture is actually a very, very
Mm.
large asset. I mean, there was a great study done by some researchers at Duke and Wharton that surveyed, I think it was about 1,400 CEOs and CFOs. It was quite a unique study because it managed to reach so many CEOs and CFOs of often very large companies. And what it found was 54% of CEOs and CFOs thought that culture was a top three driver of financial value creation out of any conceivable driver. So considering the choice of CEO, the strength of the strategy, the strength of the competition, the strength of the supply chain, and so on and so on. The majority of CEOs and CFOs believe that culture is a top three driver of value creation. So there is on some level a recognition among senior leaders that culture is incredibly important
Mm.
already.
Mm.
And in some ways you don't have to convince them too
Mm.
much of that. But where the breakdown occurs then is, in practice, what actually is culture? You read on LinkedIn, there are all these, random posts about culture that could mean 100 different
Exactly.
things, and they don't seem super credible. You know what I mean? So it's this process of making culture scientific, which is really around making culture
Exactly.
measurable, that we believe is going to hopefully transform this truth that CEOs and CFOs already have in their head, that culture really matters, into something they can actually manage on a day-to-day basis, just like they might manage another asset in a company.
Mhm. Well said. And while we're on the topic of, trying to demystify, as you say, culture and making it data-driven dimension where top leadership invests, I would say, and you just confirm that when it comes to culture related, let's say, technology, ROI is still a concern, right? So maybe you can share from your experience, what metrics would you say are good to be tracked so management can know that we are on the right path to measure culture, giving feedback, recognition, or just being an enabler for our mid management? What metrics should you follow?
Yeah, I mean, you should follow any metrics that you have. It's going to depend on the company what your exact metrics are. I mean, there's some companies relatively advanced that employ things like O&A analysis, so that that's great if you have it. But really, in my experience, most companies do not have super advanced listening strategies, and they don't have very advanced cultural metrics. And this isn't just small companies. I work with many of the largest leading companies in the world, and this is very often the case there too. So I would say, the metrics you'd probably have before you installed a culture AI measurement system will tend to be things like basically engagement levels on an engagement
Mhm.
survey. So that's not a bad metric to pay attention to. It gives you a sense of the employee experience. And then you always want to be paying attention, especially if you're a very large company, to what's going on externally. You always want to pay attention to Glassdoor, Indeed, what employees are saying there in the free text, if you have the capabilities to measure the free text, and what they're saying in their Likert scale ratings, like the overall rating. So just practically, those are normally the only two metrics that most companies
Mm,
have. I mean, ideally, you would have more metrics than that. I know CMOS Cloud gives companies a lot of great metrics that they can utilize. But then if you do install a Culture AI measurement system, then you're set, because then you have a lot of metrics. You can understand what employees are speaking about when they speak about hundreds of different topics. And for instance, if say one of your objectives is to improve your culture of
mhm,
agility,
mhm,
right? Before that was pretty difficult, because it's difficult to get a good measure of agility in a company. I mean, how do you actually do it? I mean, maybe you can do things like measuring I mean, I'm trying to think of one. I mean, you can do things like trying to measure the speed with which people respond to emails, things like that. That might be a metric. There may be a couple different ways you can do it. But then if you actually install effective cultural measurement, you can just simply see when employees talk about the company, when they talk about the pros and the cons of the company, how often do they mention agility
mhm.
critically in 2024? Say they mention it critically 15% of the time, and then you can come back in 2025 and see, okay, now they're mentioning it critically 9% of the time. So then you can say that's a reliable metric for progress in agility. And effective cultural measurement using text analytics makes it a lot easier to measure this across hundreds of different topics. So you can measure this for agility, but you can also measure it for individual dimensions of bureaucracy,
Mm,
hierarchy, flexible processes, and see exactly how employees are speaking about these hundreds of different topics. Now, that being said, I don't recommend just using, a platform like that to
mhm,
measure the culture. If you do have other
mhm,
metrics like response times
mhm,
to emails or O&A analysis, I, of course, recommend, getting as many good metrics as
mhm.
you can, and then trying to synthesize them all to triangulate, the truth. But the reality for most companies is they don't have very many of these metrics to begin with. So if you want one, relatively low cost solution that's going to give you a much, much better understanding of your culture and really just give you everything that you need in order to improve your culture, I'd recommend investing in a cultural AI platform, and that'll give you, hundreds of these important metrics.
Exactly. Very, very good point. And I would just like to add here that perhaps it's not just that the companies don't have always the right and all the needed KPIs to follow, but they also may lack the skills and capacity of their internal teams to be driving this entire, let's say, change, right? So it will also require for most companies to get on this journey to equip their leaders, HR teams, or whoever is driving the process. Thank you for tuning in to People Pulse. Charlie shared some amazing tips on building healthier, more productive companies. If you like what you heard, don't forget to subscribe and share it with your network. Keep your finger on the pulse of your people, empower them, and success will follow.